We've all seen Space Invaders before, but not everyone has played a Neo Geo arcade machine or played a bullet hell before. I didn't look into them myself until around 2010, but I had played Galaga, Galaxian, and Gradius before in the arcades, and on things like the Namco Museum compilations. On the surface, these games kind of all look the same. Galaga looks like Space Invaders, cave games look like Touhou, R-Type looks like Gradius. But there's little differences between each one that gives each game its own personality. So what is a shmup anyways? The term shmup or shoot 'em up has always been a point of confusion for talking about this genre ever since like Wolfenstein 3D came out. Because when you say shooter, someone will say, oh yeah, I've played COD. You do shoot in a first-person shooter, but I've always called those FPS games, not shooters or shmups. In Japan, shmups are apparently called STGs, which I can only guess stands for shooting? Anyways, I don't want to talk too much about the early history of these games. I want to talk more about the aesthetic appeal of them, and what I find fun about them personally. If you've played Centipede, Asteroids, Tempest, or Defender in the arcades, you'll know there's something a bit magical about them. And I think that's what hooked a lot of people on gaming in the early 80s. Old games are hard, and the challenge of that keeps on bringing me back to them, to try to beat the games on one credit, the Mystic 1cc. In a spaceship shooter, you usually have 3 lives, 3 bombs, and downing enemies will sometimes cause an upgrade to float around the screen that you could catch. You then shoot wider and with more bullets, but if you die once, then you lose the upgrades. It's kinda like a roguelike. These games can get really difficult, and they are called bullet hell games for a reason. And by the way, bullet hell games are also called Danmaku games, which I'm gonna call them later. There's a thrill that comes with dodging massive labyrinths of bullets, and you get into a flow state. It requires a lot of precision and reflex to not get hit when you have bullets flying at you constantly. One thing that continues to bring me back to 90s games is the music. CD audio had just come out and Japan was still at their economic peak, so we were getting amazing music out of gaming. Part of what made 80s video game soundtracks so catchy was that because of the low fidelity sound chips of systems like the NES, composers had to focus on melody to create memorable music. If the sound chip sounds like shit, at least the melodies could sound good, right? So we had the Mario games, the Mega Man games, Kirby, Castlevania, all with great melodies to their music. By the mid-90s, game hardware wasn't holding back the sound design anymore, and especially with shmups, which usually aren't that colorful on the surface, the music is where they went all out. If RGB LED lights sounded like something, I think it would sound like this. I was the type of kid that had video game music on my MP3 player, and this is what I would listen to sometimes. I had Nirvana albums and stuff, but I like video game music too. Although I didn't live through the 80s, I did start gaming and going to the arcades in the 90s, and arcade games in general are just nostalgic for me. Most shmups were best played in the arcades, and much like fighting games, the best ports were to the higher power consoles. Pac Man on the Atari 2600 was pretty terrible, and likewise, it wasn't until the PS1 and the Sega Saturn that the ports of shmups started getting really good. I would say the NES had some good ones like Gradius, R-Type, and Star Soldier, and the Genesis had a lot of good ones like the Thunder Force series and Musha, but in my opinion the best shmups came from the arcades. The 80s seemed to be obsessed with cool people, whether it was Tom Cruise, Schwarzenegger, slick radio songs by Hall & Oates, and also obsessed with the future. With the increasing dominance of computers, you started seeing things like Blade Runner, Tron, Back to the Future 2, and Transformers. I think that's where the synthwave and vaporwave music genres came out of. But one quirk of all that is that you started seeing this like fetishization of motorcyclists, sports cars, pilots, and aircrafts. Although the Japanese mech genre did start many decades before, I think that at the very least movies like Top Gun made this fascination with aircraft more marketable in the Western world. And much like Kurosawa in Star Wars, or Snow White in anime, Japan and the USA have been bouncing ideas off each other for a long time. Most of my favorite anime are mech or sci-fi related personally. I don't know why, but dramatic stories about the human condition seem to go well with mechs. Fighting against aliens, facing total annihilation, dealing with aging or loss, accelerated through relativistic time dilation in movies like Interstellar or Gunbuster. I just love sci-fi, man. I have a major respect for the illustrators that design the jets and mechs in anime, as a shitty illustrator myself. Mech designers like Shoji Kawamori, who designed Optimus Prime actually, and the VF-1 Valkyrie from Macross, or Robotech, you might know it as Robotech. or Hajime Katoki, who created many of the famous Gundam designs and worked on the Virtua series. And I don't really know why I like mechs actually, but I think it's just the 10-year-old in me, and it seems like this positive ideal that humanity can strive towards. And I wish that we had mechs like this. So there's this whole package of reasons that continually brings me back to shmups. The music, the 80s and 90s, the jet designs, the challenge of them. I also like that they're niche personally. So let's look at horizontal versus vertical shooters, bullet hells, and some shmups with unique mechanics. So there's horizontal shmups, and then there's vertical shmups, and then there's vertical shmups which use a horizontal screen. The last one can be kind of a bitch because you're looking upwards towards the short end of the screen, so you have less reaction time to move out of the way of bullets. The game that kicked off the genre to me is Space Invaders, which came out in '78, and that's a vertical shmup. But most shmups from the 70s into the early 90s were horizontal shmups. These games are easier than vertical shmups, I find, because this is before the bullet hell was invented. They're still hard, don't get me wrong, but they're not as hard, I find. This is the experimentation phase, so the frame might move around in patterns. You may be navigating around a lot of non-touchable terrain. There can be little guys scuttling around on the top and bottom like Goombas. Aww. And the ship upgrades are not as good. But there is a charm to these games, and here's a few of my favorites. I think that IREM was the king of the horizontal shooter, and Konami and Taito tie for second, since Konami did make Gradius and Parodius, and Taito made the Darius series, which is one of my all-time favorites. Gradius might be the most perfect shmup for the NES, and Darius introduced branching paths, kinda like the ones in Outrun. There's a lot of great horizontal shmups, but vertical shmups are the better experience in my opinion, even if you're playing on a horizontal monitor. You started seeing them more by the mid-90s from studios like Cave, Rising, and Psycho, and getting really cool mechanics like the lock-on mechanics from Raystorm, and the duality mechanic from Ikaruga. And whereas a lot of the NES shmups look like the same, by the Rising era you could see a lot more personality in the games. Armed Police Batrider takes place in the city, and you can destroy cars for points while you're taking on enemy planes. There's also anime illustrations, and I just love how he says, "Welcome to Violence City." Guange is an ancient Japan-themed bullet hell game with flying temples, shogun warriors, and a lot of blood and guts. There's actually destructible environments and directional aiming. At the end you're fighting demon yokai and there's a boss rush of ghosts. Kingdom Grand Prix is a racing shmup. Ready? Go! Touhou is also a vertical shmup, and I think a lot of normies think that this is the peak of the shmup genre. Touhou didn't invent the bullet hell genre, but it pushed it maybe as far as it ever went, with extremely narrow wiggle room between thousands of bullets on the screen. Wikipedia says that Batsugun was the first bullet hell in 1993, but look at this and then look at this and tell me what more resembles hell. I first encountered Touhou on the early days of YouTube actually, because it's now known more for its music and its anime designs than anything. Touhou project was made by one Dojinsoft developer, Zune, who made the games as a way to showcase his musical compositions. The names of the games are kind of hard to remember, like Subterranean Animism. And I don't really know the story, but you're in an alternate world with yokai and demon girls or something. There's a weird trend of shmups where it's a magical human throwing magic spells all over the place, and Touhou is one of them. Elemental Masters like this. I've always preferred spaceship shooters though, over magical spell shmups. Flying by futuristic skyscrapers and subway trains, or weaving between asteroids to blow up space colonies. I find that pretty cool, you know. And I like the creative ways that the developers mechanize things. Like the Darius series is all about shooting down giant mechanical fish. One of my favorite movies is Tetsuo the Iron Man. It's about a man that fetishizes metal and mechanization and then gains metal powers like conjuring up scrap metal. It has a really industrial vibe to it, kind of like Akira. And I feel like it captures this weird interest I have in things like mechanical fish and just like scrap metal. And again, let's look at some anime style spaceships. I just love Japan's vision of what the future could be. Anyways, now let's look at some of the best of the shmup games, starting with Dodonpachi. Although Touhou is popularly known as the bullet hell game, I think it was Cave that mastered this genre. They were the first ones to start using pink bullets that are easy to see. The graphics are always high production, and they often put in extra perks for beating their game, such as in this game where there's a second loop, as in a second playthrough, where you can fight Hachi, the bee that's on the game logo. And if you beat him, you fight the real final boss, Hibachi. But it's like very hard to achieve this, but it's cool that they put this in there. Maybe I should back up and say this game has 6 stages. If you beat it once, you get the false ending, but if you 1cc the game and pass a few other conditions, you can access the second loop. To be clear, this alone is insanely hard to do, and I've never managed to 1cc Dodonpachi. I have put hundreds of hours into this game, but I don't think I could ever 1cc this game. To shit on Touhou again though, I have 1cc Touhou games. They're not as hard as they sound. And that's the difference with Cave games. Cave games are masterful. They're like Enzo Ferrari putting out another masterpiece for us normies to marvel over. They're meant to be difficult but always fun. I have rage quit bad shmups many times, but with Cave shmups I don't feel cheated when I die. I resign myself to death. I deserved it. In Japan, arcades are much more popular than they are in the West now. People line up in droves to play the arcade games. This includes old men too, who come into the arcade after a 12-hour workday to de-stress. But there's a cultural rule that when you die in the game, you don't get to press continue. You only get one chance. And yet, there's middle-aged men who can one-credit clear a game as hard as this after waiting at the back of the line for 20 minutes. Again, the appeal of shmups is the pursuit of excellence. It's seeing how close to the perfect playthrough you can get on something that's designed to brutally destroy you. Dodonpachi might be the most perfectly balanced shmup in my opinion, but it's still too hard for me to 1cc. To elaborate on the game again, there's 3 ships, a straight shot, a directional shot, and a 3-way spread shot. But as with most shmup games, I just use option A and practice with it for hundreds of hours. We don't talk about Dodonpachi 2. It wasn't made by Cave. Very cheap game with bad music and bad visuals. So Dodonpachi DaiOuJou is the official second game in the series, and DaiOuJou means blissful death, and that's a pretty apt description. It's the sort of game where you pop a fat stroke after raising your blood pressure too high, trying to hyper-focus on dodging the bullets, and then raging when you don't. There's more intricacies to the ships in this game. Ship 1 has a good spread shot but a weak laser, and you can hold 6 bombs. Ship 2 has a good laser but a weak spread shot, and you can hold 4 bombs. Ship 3 has a good spread and laser, you can only have 2 bombs. There's also the hyper system, where if you get large combos, you build up your hyper meter. If you redeem it for a power-up, all the bullets will disappear off the screen and you'll be powered up. I love the environments in this game. The first level is a very surreal, futuristic Neo-Tokyo sort of city. The lasers and explosions are some of the best in shmups. The backgrounds are all 2D, which makes it easier to see what's happening than something like Ikaruga, which has shit like clunky 3D cargo ships distracting you. The environment should be beautiful, but distraction's a big part of why I don't really like polygon shmups. And this brings me to my section on Ikaruga. Ikaruga is made by Treasure, who's known for amazing stuff like Radiant Silvergun and Gunstar Heroes. They made some of the best Sega Genesis games too, so they've earned a great reputation, but a lot of people's favorite shmup is Ikaruga, and I feel like this game is a chore. I hate waiting through the 5-second poetry screens, which take you out of the game. Your hitbox is apparently the size of your cockpit, but I feel like I just spontaneously die in this game. I think the 3D aspects of this game are sort of nice looking, but they're too distracting, so I die way easier in the bullets in this game than in any other Danmaku style game. There's also lasers that push you around like a tidal wave at some parts, which push you so hard that you have to lean into them for a few seconds. But then when you get out, you fly away super fast and blow up against a wall. There's also scripted mazes where if you're not in a certain position at a certain point, you're dead. You'll get straight up blocked out and the screen scroll will kill you. There's a very narrow window. This is more of a memorization and logic game than a bullet avoidance game. You can get through this game by just absorbing bullets and not shooting. I think that's cool, kind of a pacifist run. It'd be very hard though. It's a polarity-based game where you absorb the bullets of the same polarity and die by bullets of the opposite color. If you're dark and shoot the light ships, your bullets do twice as much damage because you could be killed by the return fire. It's a risk versus reward mechanic. On the other hand, you can just dwell on the friendly bullets and absorb them, but you won't have the boosted attack. Absorbing the bullets charges your meter too, which gives you a homing laser. Anyways, this game kinda just pisses me off. Your hitbox is massive. This game is very mathematical. So when you die, it isn't just the usual skill issue, it's an insult to your intelligence. Before I touch on another game, I want to talk about the companies that were big in the 80s through 2000 shmup renaissance. Some of these companies big in the Japan shmup scene were Touhou, Takumi, Taito, Treasure, Saikyo, Konami, Rising, Irem, Success, Cave, and Seibu Kaihatsu. Touhou made some of the less popular shmups such as Zero Wing or Twin Cobra in the 80s. They also purportedly invented the bullet hell with Batsugun. They got in the industry before a lot of the other companies, so they're one of the granddaddies of shmups. But they went bankrupt in '94, and in its ashes, many companies were created by the former employees. Takumi, Rising, Gazelle, and Cave. Gazelle didn't make much more than a Sailor Moon beat-em-up game. Takumi made Giga Wing and Mars Matrix on the Dreamcast. Taito was created in the 50s and made Space Invaders in the late 70s. Irem was an OG from the 70s as well, but they got big with R-Type in 87. Konami was founded in the 60s, but hit it big in 81 with Frogger and Scramble. And then a few years later, they were probably the biggest third party on the NES with Castlevania, Contra, Metal Gear, Gradius, Goemon, and the TMNT games. Treasure was founded by an ex-Konami employee. Seibu Kaihatsu made all the Raiden games, which was one of the biggest shmup series of the 90s. Saikyo made the Strikers series, which I was never very into. Gunbird is pretty cool though. Success Corporation made the Cotton series, which, by the way, is a cute-em-up game. Cute-em-ups are kawaii shmups. This was a thing for some reason. So here's the chart. My favorite companies of this era were Cave, Rising, Irem, and Taito, followed by Takumi and Treasure. This group of developers defined the renaissance of shmups, and I admire them for it. They pushed the genre as far as it ever went, and created challenging arcade games that otaku like me will be obsessed with forever. And yeah, I don't know how to end this essay actually. I was gonna talk about another shmup and maybe like bring up some weird shmups, like Cho Aniki, but this is about spaceship shooters, so I'm just gonna end on this thing that you're watching right now, and thank you for watching. Hope you have a great week.